Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today, we're taking a look at the AT3 Quad Rail. This is their Pro Quad Rail receiver set. This should, in theory, be a fairly simple video considering we're only talking about a quad rail and its accompanying upper receiver. Now, before we get into the video, of course, you can like, share, and subscribe as that is free and does help me out quite a bit. Also, comment theoretically anything down below. Now, on top of that, there's also my website, which should have some things in stock, restocked, hopefully at least a couple different series back in stock. And then next week or so, we should have everything back in stock. Now, getting into full disclosure on the AT3 Pro Quad Rail and upper receiver, this is their combo kit, of course. Full disclosure on this, I am actually a dealer for AT3. One of my customers wanted to use a specific AT3 rail for his build, one of his Mark Vs, and so I was happy to oblige. Now, to get set up as a dealer for AT3, they require an initial purchase of like $500. So I picked up a few odds and ends as well to kind of meet that minimum threshold. One of those was this very interesting upper receiver kit. Now, on top of wanting to try out the upper receiver set, I also may use this for future builds as well, specifically the 12.5-inch quad rail, because I do think it has some very nice characteristics about it. So, getting into specifics on the upper receiver and rail set, starting with the rail. This is, of course, a quad rail. Now, they make two different versions of this rail. They make the quad rail, which is just their AT3 Pro, and then their AT3 SPEAR is the M-LOK version. Personally, I was mostly interested in the quad rail version, as I do tend to like quad rails, even though they do add some weight. Now, with the quad rail design itself, you do, of course, have 4 rows of Picatinny on all the 3, 6, 9, and, of course, 12 o'clock positions. Now, on this one, they have taken a lot of care to remove as much weight and material as possible. Usually, in an M-LOK rail, that is a bad idea because that is leaving you with an extremely thin, light rail that is prone to bending and breaking, which, as we'll get into, this rail is not prone to bending or breaking whatsoever. So the Picatinny on top is very nicely scalloped out. You have 5 large ventilation cuts as well. Those ventilation cuts are repeated on the sides and the bottom as well. And they machine out a lot of the material, the connective tissue, if you will, between the rail sets. Now, the advantage of having a quad rail is like having 4 backbones, essentially. On a normal M-LOK rail, everything kind of hangs off the strongest section of the rail, which is the top section, the Picatinny rail. On this one here, however, you basically have 4 separate backbones, so you can allow yourself the ability to remove some excess material. Now, on top of the weight reduction cuts, the scalloping, the venting, you do actually also have 5 QDs, 3 up front, and then 2 here in the back. On top of that, they are the appropriate anti-rotation, so you only get about 20 degrees of rotation in the actual QD sockets as well, which most people will prefer. Personally, I'm kind of ambivalent one way or the other, but most people do seem to prefer it this way. Now, the rail itself with the aluminum barrel nut, which this does use an aluminum barrel nut, which so do Geisley rails as well. I don't really have a problem with the aluminum barrel nut unless it's on a machine gun or something where you could be doing extreme volumes of fire. An aluminum barrel nut is going to be just fine. Now, on this, the rail with the barrel nut, this is the 12.5-inch version on a 14.5 Expo Arms barrel. We'll get into that in a future video, I suppose. The rail and the barrel nut come in at 15 ounces. Now, that's not that bad. A comparable M-LOK handguard with a steel barrel nut will come in at about 13-ish ounces. So overall, you're only sacrificing 2 to 5 ounces, depending on the rail that you're comparing it against. Now, moving back to the upper receiver itself, this is one of those billet upper receivers that you will see floating around that has kind of been rebranded by everybody. I'm not sure who is actually making this specific billet upper receiver. However, it is 7075, and in this case, Cerakoted this very nice OD green. Now, this is a slick side billet upper receiver. Other than that, dimensionally, it is a bit thicker than your standard forged upper receiver, so it is going to be a bit heavier. So in total, this upper receiver, or this rail and upper receiver combo, is going to be like 3-4 ounces heavier than a different rail and upper receiver, like just a standard forged upper receiver is going to be a little bit lighter. Now, the main reason that I was interested in this rail and receiver combo is because AT3 has gone one step further on the billet upper receiver and actually machined in notches in the upper receiver in which the anti-rotation tabs actually slot into. Now, anti-rotation tabs on handguards are important. During drop tests, I have broken them. Even on like the Midwest Industries combat rail, they have very substantial anti-rotation tabs. However, in a double drop test that I did on an optic quite some time ago, I completely bent out one of those anti-rotation tabs. Now, what I like about this one here is that it has a lot of contact area and a lot of material, especially when you combine both of the tabs or the integration tabs that lock into your upper receiver. Now, the reason why this video is probably titled something like Super Duty at Home is because that is what Geissele does as well. Now, Geissele uses a singular notch on the top, so their rails actually notch into a standard forged upper receiver on top. And in terms of material contact, it's actually going to be about the same. The single notch on the Geissele is a little bit bigger. The AT3 has two of them on either side. Now, the rigidity of this upper receiver is going to be greater than a standard forged upper receiver. It has a lot more material on it. Now, AT3 designed this very well. And so if you were to take this rail, put it on another upper receiver, then instead of acting as integration tabs, they would act as just normal anti-rotation tabs. So they serve kind of a dual role. However, they will not fit on other billet upper receivers that have an enlarged front section without having those notches cut into them. Now, what that means is that you get a lot of contact area between your upper receiver and your rail, in theory, providing a much stronger lockup and more resistance to rotation. Now, there are a lot of different methods for mounting a handguard. The most secure that I have ever seen is probably on this PWS. This is the Mark 111 Mod 1. So this uses a non-round barrel nut, so the barrel nut is actually angular, and then the handguard slips over top of the barrel nut and has no rotation whatsoever. And then it also has 6 set screws that mount directly to the barrel nut. Now, there is basically zero play between the rail and the barrel nut to begin with, and on top of that, it is torqued down by 6 steel bolts into a steel barrel nut. That is about as secure as it can get when it comes to negating rotation in a handguard. There are other ways that attempt to do the same thing. Like, for instance, on this Bear Creek Arsenal, this is their newest generation of handguards. This one here also indexes off of the barrel nut itself. However, the barrel nut is circular and the handguard is circular, so this can just rotate freely on the barrel nut. And then you have 8 set screws that thread into the barrel nut and then provide clamping force to make sure that that rail doesn't shift. However, with enough force on this, because it doesn't actually thread into or stop the rail, there's a little bit of play between the rail and the screws, and of course the barrel nut is not holding the rail in place. The screws are. If they were to come loose or just not be quite tight enough, you could possibly get like 1, 2, or 3 degrees of rotation on this style of handguard. Now, what the Geissele and AT3 rail attempt to negate is that potential for rotation on the handguard itself by having these notches cut into the upper receiver, in theory kind of making the upper receiver and rail one piece. However, there's always a bit of gap in there, and so there is, like in this rail specifically, maybe 2 or 3 degrees of play, and even in the Geissele with their very large single notch up top, there's again 1 or 2 degrees of rotation possible, of maximum possible rotation in either direction, because they don't quite match up perfectly. Very, very close, very tight, but not quite perfectly. Now, as you will have already seen at this point in the video, we dropped this rail quite a bit. Now, we dropped it from 30 feet 3 times, and then 10 or 15 feet, throwing it up in the air and letting it land on rocks and what have you, because we're actually do shoot in a shut down part of a rock quarry. That big dome where we shoot used to be part of a rock quarry that is no longer in operation, and so there may look to be some green stuff on the ground, but that is mostly just moss and a tiny bit of grass growing on top of rock. So the rail itself handled all of the drops exceptionally well. Now, there was no bending, no denting, there was no loss of center on the barrel to the handguard, so it did not bend and go out of round and start pointing a random direction. So in terms of its structural durability, excellent, 10 out of 10, no problems whatsoever. Now, because the Picatinny is scalloped out, Some of the Picatinny got crushed a little bit just by virtue of landing, with the entire weight of the gun on top of a singular piece of Picatinny rail that is scalloped out, so there is less Picatinny. So there are a couple spots on the rail where I could not use something at that specific Picatinny slot, but the rail itself has held up exceptionally well. Now the problem is that the rail did rotate just a little bit. Basically, again, as I mentioned, these notches do fit into the upper receiver, but there is a tiny bit of play in there, and they did reach their maximum potential for rotation, so it is fully offset to the right as far as it can go before the notches make perfect contact with either side. So the rail did shift because, again, it did rotate, again, about that, 1 degree or so, which is the maximum potential rotation on this rail, and you can definitely notice it. That would throw off your zero if you had something on the end of this rail that needed to maintain zero, whether that be a laser aiming module or an iron sight or what have you. So while the indexing tabs are stronger and they do provide a better lockup than anti-rotation tabs externally on the upper receiver do, you get a lot more contact surface this way. It's still not perfect. Again, the best way is the PWS Mark 111 that one has a barrel nut that does not allow the handguard to rotate whatsoever, and then on top of that it is bolted down, which is the most secure way that I've seen on a rail to date. This one here is good, but not quite perfect. Now, the way that this rail actually attaches to the barrel nut itself is via 2 steel cross bolts. Now, this is 2 steel cross bolts into aluminum that kind of clamp down onto the bottom part of the barrel nut. Unfortunately, with clamp designs, you really only get pressure at the lower half of the barrel nut. You really don't get much up top like a wedge lock system would do. And again, the Geisley rails, which also do use a clamping method, they are double the torque. I believe these ones here I torque down to about 35, 40 inch-pounds. Geisleys are 96 inch-pounds. And on top of that, they have a dog leg nut, which applies that surface or that clamping force over a much wider area. So overall, the Geisley lockup, while this is definitely a Super Duty at home, the Geisley lockup is better and more secure. Now, again, as we've already discussed, the strength of the rail is perfect. It is a quad rail with a lot of material there. Even though it has lightning cuts everywhere, it is still a lot stronger and a little bit heavier than other rails that are going to be, Keymod, M-LOK, or what have you. Even with the indexing tabs, if this rail encounters a harsh impact or 15 harsh impacts in a row, it does have a possibility for shift. Now, it's not much, but then if you need to go from a harsh impact to, depending on this rifle, on the whatever it is on the end of your rifle that you need to maintain zero and you need to take a shot at 100, 200, 300 yards, is that actually going to line up perfectly and return to zero? Probably not, or actually I would guarantee you that it is not, because the further out you go, while here it might only seem like a little bit, the rail has moved just a little bit off to the right, that could drastically change your point of impact at extended distances. So again, while the strength of the rail is great, and I like the way that it locks up, it is definitely better than most rails out there with the indexing tabs. It is still not perfect, it is still not ideal, and so if it does encounter a harsh impact or several harsh impacts, it will most likely have a slight rotation one way or the other, again, depending on how that impact actually occurs. It doesn't need to be a drop. It could be a slam into a piece of metal, a door, something else like that. Basically, anything that applies rotational force to the handguard could, in theory, get the zero to shift, because again, the indexing tabs do not perfectly mate up with the upper receiver. So while it is a stronger lockup and it does limit how much rotation is possible, it is still not perfect. So let me know what you guys think of this rail and upper receiver set, specifically how they lock up together and whether this is something that I should put on one of my builds in the future. Now, going over the upper receiver itself, it did take a ton of damage. However, the build as a whole, everything did fine. The SIG Romeo 8T is perfectly fine. The titanium shroud did dent a little bit, but that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to take that force. The only thing that broke on the gun is actually the buffer tube. There's either a dent or it's like bent a little bit because the bolt likes to get caught up in the back. Now, it's not bad, and we did shoot this after the drops and it was still functioning. However, it can bind up a little bit in the back, so I think that the buffer tube is either bent or there's a dent in it somewhere that I don't see, but either way, that will probably need to be replaced. The gun is still functional and works just fine. And this whole build is really kind of a super duty at home, if you will. So we do have a chrome-lined barrel. This is the Expo Arms 14.5. This is the cheapest chrome-lined barrel on the market. I picked it up for 70 bucks on sale, so we will be doing a specific video on that. And then, of course, we have our tried and true nickel boron BCG by Toolcraft in there. So it is kind of a super duty at home, kind of upgraded components with an interlocking receiver set, and also an excuse to put together some random components and make some videos. So again, with all that out of the way, guys, let me know what you guys think of the AT3, either the Pro Quad or the SPEAR Upper Receiver rail set, because I do think that the concept is interesting. It's not executed quite perfect because, again, we can still get some rotation on the rail if you apply enough force to it. But again, thank you guys once again for watching. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below, and I will see you in the next one. Peace off.